Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Neurodiversity Gold Podcast with me, Jude Morrow. It's the plugs at the top of the episode, and it's my podcast, and we haven't sold our souls to any advertising agencies yet. So I'm going to plug my new book, which is The Ghosts of Riots Past, which was out this week. It's my debut novel. Novel? I don't know what a novel is. A Nobel Prize would be nice. A novel, which centers on the Free Dairy story from the point of view of the First Aid Corps. It's what one would call my experimental third album. It's out now. It's available Barnes and Noble, Amazon, indie bookshops, everywhere where you get your books. And we're still very much on the hunt for executive producers for the Neurodiversity Gold podcast. You can join the mission, join the struggle at patreon.com/neurodiversity gold podcast. And you can learn more details at our very snazzy podcast website, the Neurodiversity Gold Podcast.com. That's an awful lot of links for you. But if you're going to prioritize one of those links, get my new book. So I've got a wonderful guest with me today, and what the conversation is going to center on for this episode is late diagnoses, particularly whenever we have episodes of the Neurodiversity Gold podcast. It's very, very clear to see that, diagnoses can come late or even not at all for anybody who's not a white middle class boy like Jude Morrow. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to the show Jules Thorogood. Jules, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much, Jude. It's a pleasure to be here.
And a pleasure to have you on. And by the way, this is your first podcast, and we are lovely, and we will put our arms around you and be like Bambi's mother to you.
Oh, thank you ever so much. I'm really grateful for that.
And whenever could come forward to come on the show, uh, you got your diagnosis of ADHD quite late on. So, did that diagnostic journey look like?
So, if I kind of put it in a little bit of context, and yes, I'm an ADHDer, and I have a rejection sensitivity dysphoria, as well as having a hypersensitive personality, which is quite a mouthful. And the jury's out on whether I have ASD. But the journey was that I grew up the youngest of a family of three to much older parents. My mum was an opera singer, and my dad was in shipping and engineering, and he had a passion for train timetables and knew every single bus route or tube route for the London Underground. I mean, it was amazing, and it was normal in my life. I just thought it was normal. Sadly, my mum died when I was 8 years old, following a period of being unwell. She had cancer. And like my brother and sister, I was sent away to school to make friends, because we lived in the country and there weren't many people around. I have to say, school, both primary and secondary, were quite an ordeal. And I did make some friends, but it was difficult. I was the one who didn't focus enough, or wasn't, I couldn't work out what was going on particularly. And so my diagnosis came when I was 50 during lockdown, and it came after a really debilitating period of ill health from 2018. I had a fab GP, and we went for test after test. They couldn't really work out what was wrong with me. I couldn't stand up. I couldn't hold a conversation. I couldn't cope with sensory overload, no light or sound, so I spent a long time in a dark room. And then I finally saw a lovely neurologist, and she persuaded me to go and see a clinical psychologist, or psychiatrist rather. And since then I've just been rebuilding, learning how to read again and cope with that kind of the cognitive overload. And looking back on it, Jude, I have to say I had so many ADHD tendencies. I was definitely prone to sensitivity. I didn't have confidence. Oh my God, I always lost my keys. Always. I met my best friends because I dropped them down the drain. I infuriated the Heathrow tannoy system because I was forever getting locked out, and my husband was coming back from a business trip several times, and he would just hear this voice over the tannoy, Mr. Thorogood, please would you come to? And yeah, it was awkward. And I had difficulties with relationships with peers, internally, with my career. Guys loved my spontaneity, but they didn't quite get the poor self-esteem, kind of sensitivity part. It got me into a lot of vulnerable places. And I knew that I always felt different. I just had no idea why I was different and what it was. And for my colleagues, it must have been quite difficult. And I'm a speech and language therapist by background, and I've worked in loads of settings, so from sure start to early years, all the way through to postgraduate healthcare education. And it's really ironic, but women really do mask, Jude. They really do. But it must have been difficult for my colleagues, not quite knowing why I didn't do things the way that everybody else did.
Of course, and just to kind of touch on what you're saying about masking, right? As I would say, if somebody was to ask me, Jude, what's the most misunderstood ND term in circulation at the minute, I would say it is masking, because people think that masking is something that people do consciously, where it's like, oh, I'm gonna just put this mask on and whatever, but it's not. It's a survival mechanism. People do it almost without any effort. Like it's almost whenever, especially when it comes to women and girls, it seems to be a crutch that the medical community is held on to. Oh, well, girls and women can mask better. So, I mean, but yeah, that is why they're diagnosed late. Now, for me, if that's not victim blaming, I don't really know what is. I've always found that where people think that, oh, those sneaky little women and girls and anybody that's not male, oh, look at them with the sneaky little maskers. It doesn't work like that. It's
um,
something like, it's almost like, do you remember years ago there was the show Stars in Their Eyes, or Stars in Your Eyes? It was hosted by Matthew Kelly, where it's like you walk out the door and you're just somebody else, and it doesn't happen consciously. I mean,
yeah.
that was certainly my experience. But there's always another theme as well whenever it comes to school. I would love any ND person, whether they're ADHD or autistic, to come forward or come on the show and say, "Yeah, I loved school. School was great," because it never ever happened. But I mean, whenever you were going through school, of course, probably ADHD wasn't even considered. Not for you anyway, was it?
No, not at all. And it's so fantastic that so much has been, how much has been found and discovered and shared over the last decade. I know that it's been around for obviously for a lot longer than that, but it really does feel like there's a sea change. And I think that if I had had an earlier diagnosis, it would have been so much less painful. I did love school. I loved the academic bit. I just couldn't kind of cope with all the other bits.
I believe it's
Well, I do believe I love the academic bits, but again, I found that a struggle because my planning, my executive functioning wasn't simple, and I didn't know how to overcome it really. But what's really interesting is that I was given lots of diagnoses when I was younger. So things around depression or stress. I had a breakdown, I was given antidepressants, or I was told I was too sensitive and I should just, take a deep breath and get on with it. And, those things really stay with you. And when people say they don't understand you, you really, really question who you are. So yeah, it's difficult. I definitely say to my younger self, never ever give up finding what it means to be you, what your sense of identity is, what's your sense of purpose, even if most of the world is saying and seems so very different. I would just say, carry on, be curious, look at things from your perspective, because non-linear thinking is just different, but it is so equally valid.
And whenever the diagnosis came, I mean, what was that moment like? Was it just like an immediate polar shift, or was it like a weight off your shoulders? It was like, I now know the answer.
um so I guess for me it was quite variable. There was part of me that was kind of happy that I had finally got, a diagnosis. I finally knew. And it was in the middle of lockdown, so you couldn't really go and talk to people face to face, and that was really, really difficult. I guess it reaffirmed the fact that I knew that I was different, and validated that. But I think for 8 months, I found it really, really difficult because a lot of the literature is really negative, and potentially, perhaps if it's, predominantly genetic, although I think there's more evidence of environmental, trauma-induced ADHD now. But I think, I have two lovely teenagers, and I was really worried for them, really worried for them. And I actually, there were days I used to sit in my room and cry, and I didn't really want to go on, because when you read literature that says you have a shortened life expectancy, and they really look at it from a deficit model, you're broken. And I thought, oh my goodness, I just, this is really tough. I don't want to live the rest of my life just knowing that I'm broken. And I came across an Attitude, Attitude magazine.
Yes,
It's,
I do.
it's an American magazine. And anyway, they had a webinar around ADHD, and it happened to be delivered by Dr. Ned Hallowell and Professor Ratty. And I can honestly say that talk was the start of really changing my life. I mean, literally, it flipped my whole perspective, and it took away my shame. Oh my goodness, the shame is crucifying. And it made me understand that I have got so many strengths. They have it in their book, ADHD 2.0. They have a really good list of all of the usefulness and all of the downsides or problems, I guess, that you experience with ADHD. But it's just, it really, it flips everything on its head. And your podcast as well, or your webinar on being an advocate for people with autism, the two together, I can honestly say, really, really saved my life. And
Thank you very much. By the way, I'll send you the check for saying that. Just give me the address, after the show, and we'll send you your gold bars and shares and NTI and everything else. We'll send you those. Thank you for that.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. But for anybody who's younger or my age or whatever, just, you're not broken. You don't need fixing. And we do need understanding from other people, and we need to be able to understand why we can be frustrating. But you're not alone, and you're so not a failure. So, and if anything else, anybody who has a late diagnosis is an utterly superhuman person, because you've lived whilst trying to be a square peg in a round hole. And you've been relentless at what you've had to cope with. So yeah, I take my hat off to anybody who's been through it.
And so do I, because going through the kind of late diagnostics, because whenever you see on like social media, whether it's LinkedIn in particular, you see a lot of, I don't know, and this is just the marketer and me coming out, like the kind of virtue signally, oh, I went through my diagnosis, I got my diagnosis today, and sharing a diagnosis on social media is probably the sexiest, trendiest thing in the world right now. But the journey itself is hard, where, having to kind of realize that you could have a new identity and, gone through that process and, kind of going through the kind of painful memories that culminated up to the point of diagnosis. It's a really, really difficult thing and something that the kind of that social media doesn't really give it credit for. Because I know we'd said, before we came on, I mean, you were working in speech and language. That's where your kind of career was forged? I mean, how was your work career?
Um, my work career was a bit like Jekyll and Hyde. So it was fantastic. I loved diagnostics. I did a lot of training and with a colleague set up a training service for schools. And those kind of activities were fantastic. I was meeting people all the time. And, I think those were good. But I would have to say that when it came to things that maybe weren't so interesting for me or I found challenging, that they were difficult. And I think when you have executive functioning difficulties in terms of organizing and planning and completing finishing, sometimes that can put a real strain on clinical work, and it can put a real strain on your relationships with your colleagues. And my last job was very strategic, and I worked twice as hard as anybody else, and I'm sure I got half or less the results. And in my case, I worked so hard to try and to do all of that planning and organizing and bring people together that actually I burnt out. I caught a virus, and it had issues with my balance and sensory stimulation or sensory overload. And it literally floored me. I mean, it was like somebody had come along and got their boxing gloves out and just gone poof straight across. And that's really tough to try when you don't understand what's going on in your own body. That's really tough to try to explain to people at work. And you can try absolutely everything to bust a gut to get back there, but it's you have to. I found work, I have to say, I worked for a big organization called Health Education England, and my manager was amazing. I have to say, she was amazing about my being unwell. And they don't quite know yet about where I've come in my learning yet, because I sadly lost my job. But what I would say to people is that if you can be brave and courageous, and you feel like you've got supportive line management, then have the conversation. And I think that's something that I really hope in the future employers look at the strengths that people bring when they come with neurodiversity, because that has the possibility of really changing the world. And the other thing I would say is that you need so much self-compassion. If you get to the place where I got, you need buckets and buckets of self-compassion. And I think is it Dr. Kristen Neff has a really good a really helpful book on developing self-compassion for yourself. You know, for me, I had to go all the way back to, I had to relearn how to breathe, so that I wasn't permanently stuck in the sympathetic nervous system in fight or flight, that I could just, sit in, rest and digest. But it is really, it's really tough. But self-compassion is there. You may not always have self-esteem, but self-compassion is, you've got to be kind. You've got to be kind to yourself. And I'm really lucky. I had lots of amazing family and friends around me, who would fill my freezer, do my washing, and my manager, she was she really understood about that. But I just don't want other people to go there. I don't want other people to go there.
Of course, and with what you've just said is pretty much the kind of reasons why I initially 4 or 5 years ago started to put myself out there a lot more, because I didn't want people to experience the same things that I did. And it's a bit sad whenever you hear many years later people going through the same things that you did when you were a teen and not much has changed. And if there's anything that creates change, as a wise person once told me, it's not going to be the government, it's not going to be world leadership, it's going to be people power. And that's how advocacy is achieved, it's how civil rights in every occasion has been achieved. So I suppose my question to you is, what's the next step in your advocacy journey?
So it's bright and shiny, I think. I have a lot of gratitude. There were days when I was, really, really down about what was going on. But I think I am so grateful. I'm so grateful that I've had the journey, that I have got amazing family and friends. I feel, Jude, like I'm a 2.5-year-old. Okay, so it's not quite 2.5 actually, but that's how long I've had my diagnosis. And I would say that I now look at the world with fresh eyes and wonder. And do you know what? I really want to step up and out without fear, to live as myself and authentically. And I'm still really learning, because I live with the symptoms of chronic fatigue. That's the downside bit, that my system was significantly flawed enough that I now have to kind of cope with levels of fatigue. But my next steps are that I'm hopefully going to train with David Gewerk in America to be an ADHD coach. And so I think that's going to be really, really positive. I've started to write, and I'm exploring. I've written one piece of narrative which is being published this year, which is a group of collective souls from across the world who are writing their stories. That's Souls for the Seed, or Seeds for the Soul rather. Sorry, there's a bit of a plug. You can get it on Amazon too, but only after you buy Jude's book.
Thank you very much. Again, we'll add your bonus onto the top.
Thank you very much. And I'm exploring writing a book with a publishing company, and about the experiences that teenagers have and that individuals have on their journey. And other than that, Jude, I don't really know. I just know that I'm going to take opportunities as they come, and maybe and hopefully balance them. And stepping into the unknown is really anxiety provoking, especially when you have all the additional psychological pieces that go along with having neurodiversity. And I mean, it took me a year of therapy to get to this point where I could share my journey. So you have to really unpick the past, but there is so much opportunity to help individuals really thrive and not just survive. And yeah, so we'll see. I'm at that kind of awkward age of kind of being perimenopausal as well, and there is very little literature around having being perimenopausal and having ADHD. So I don't know, who knows. But I just, can I share a quote that it's sort of a quote from one of the newspapers, and it's a bit out there, so forgive me, but I read this post before I clicked on saying, can I come and chat with you. I read this post. It said, put the past behind you and reach into and grab your future, and don't let chance seal your fate. And I really do believe that so many people have so much to offer, but they need it. They need a platform, and they need people to say that it's okay to say things.
And I think that is a wonderful, wonderful way to end the show. And you know what? I think as far as coaches, I mean, anybody who wants to kind of launch into the ADHD and autism kind of coaching spheres, it's normally us they come to. And I think you'll be a really, really welcome and brilliant addition to the sphere. I think you have a lot to say, you have a lot of wisdom, and given your professional background as well, it really seems like a no-brainer. And that was an absolutely fantastic episode. I really enjoyed that chat. Huge thanks to you, Jules Thorogood, for joining us. And as always, we will be back next week for another edition of the Neurodiversity Gold Podcast.